Hi everyone and welcome back to another Mr. Sensible. Today I'm going to give you a response to Anthony Riley's response to my response to his video. I know it's confusing. Before I do, big thanks as ever to my patrons. With massive thanks to all my patrons, including new patrons Blair Sadovitz, Brian Rolke, Peter Lennox, Sky Wizardless and TC Lucas, and my newest patrons Mike Apple and John Stock. Thank you all so very much. So Anthony had done a video where he showed a couple of experiments with glass containers, with bromine gas and vacuums and so on. And I did a response video together with diagrams explaining things. He has responded to that and basically is saying that I'm misrepresenting my position. So here is the response to that. I may have to cut some little bits out, but I shall endeavour to address all of his points. Well, Anthony, take it away and roll VT to it. But he did not want me to use gravity because obviously he doesn't accept gravity. He didn't want me to use gravity.
No, it's not that I don't accept gravity, it's that your current science states that it's no longer a force and is best approximated by Einstein's theory of general relativity. So before we go any further, I think we need to just remind this little guy, Cheeseman, what the theory of general relativity says. I'll tell you what, you just do it with this, don't you? Gravity. So you just type in gravity into Google, and then you get the NASA one, which tells you it's a force. But what ballers usually do is they rely on Wikipedia. Look at this. Gravity, weight. Gravitation is a natural phenomenon by which all things with mass or energy, including planets, stars, even light, are brought towards gravity. I want the bit where it says, here we go. Gravity is most accurately described by the theory of general relativity, get off that, proposed by Einstein in 1915, which describes gravity not as a force, Mr. Sensible, but as an effect of the curvature of space-time caused by the uneven distribution of mass.
Remind this little guy. Well, my chubby friend, you skipped straight over the first definition that you say is by NASA, where it says gravity is a force, to pick the one that you want. But that's fine, don't have a problem with that. So you said it's not that you don't accept gravity, but it's not a force. And it's best described by Einstein's theory of general relativity. So whether it's a force or not, you accept that it's having an effect. It actually makes no difference whether you think of it as a force or a curvature of space-time. Either way, objects are going to fall towards Earth, either because a force is pulling them, or because the curvature of space-time means they roll down that slope towards the Earth. So I don't see it as a problem anyway.
It takes time because the air and the bromine molecules are colliding with themselves and each other. So what would happen if there was no air for the bromine to bump into?
Well, you've got fail number one there, Anthony. That diagram showed the bromine pushing against the air, the molecules of bromine lifting and mixing with the air.
Yeah, but in the Earth's atmosphere, it's all pushed against the atmosphere of the vacuum of space, which doesn't have any particles in it.
The atmosphere of space that doesn't have particles? I presume you just mean the vacuum.
And for there to be pressure, it has to push against something, the walls of its container. But the problem with a vacuum, as I demonstrated in the video, is there is no container, because it's the vacuum of space and the pressure pushes into it, and I demonstrated it with science. So, what's your point?
There is no air in space. It's a vacuum.
Correct.
There's nothing for it to push against.
Correct!
I'm not sure why you're laughing, because we have never said otherwise. Anyway, we're now going to get on to the experiments and my breakdowns.
Bit like this is the bit he's going to miss. Or I don't know how he's going to get out of this, because he's just cornered himself into a mess. This is the vacuum of space. It requires a container to create the vacuum, right? But imagine that there was no container and it was just the vacuum of space. When they open the tap and it fucks off into space, that's what happens. The atmosphere goes.
All the air has been removed from this apparatus, apart from the flask containing bromine.
Let's hold this. This is the vacuum of space. No pressure, no atmosphere, no nothing. This would be Earth, although there's no membrane.
Which is isolated by a tap.
So this experiment is not actually matching that diagram, is it? The flask
No, it's contrasting from the diagram, isn't it? Which is my point.
contains a vacuum and not air above bromine. But let's carry on. So we've got vacuum in the flask, like space, and we've got a smaller flask with bromine in, which is not like our atmosphere, as it's not got a gradient.
Oh, but there is a gradient in there, isn't there? A little gradient, microscopic, but there is a gradient in there because, well, everything's a gradient, isn't it? You'd have to scale it up to understand the concept, but if you were to make that massive, like a swimming pool, and put all the gas in it, there is more pressure at the bottom.
Well, being picky, yes, there's a gradient, but it's almost immeasurable. The point being the gradient is not going down to nothing, as it does with the atmosphere. It's going from, let's say, 14.7 to 14.69999999, which is next to, will be next to zero, which is not what we have.
Where's the singing bit?
And it spreads immediately. Watch again.
This destroys your model.
Well, I think it is not pop goes our model, because that is not, it is not our model. Nobody has ever said you have the atmosphere, the bromine in this experiment, at a pressure right next to a vacuum. So, Mr. Riley, I made it clear there again. You don't get 14.7 or 14.699999 right next to zero.
Yeah, you do.
We have a gradient.
Yeah, you can't have a gradient without a container.
Can't you? Have a look at this weather map. You can see the variations in pressure. You've got that low pressure of 974 millibars pretty much in the centre, rising out as high as 1024, 1026. No container around that high or low pressure area, and there's a gradient in between.
Where does the gradient come from? This is the bit that you guys completely ignore. Why are you claiming gradient when to have the gradient in the first place you require containment? It's in the definition.
Well, I'm not surprised you've just face-palmed yourself after having said that.
In a vacuum, there's no air to collide with. The bromine diffuses much faster.
Absolutely right. We have never, ever disputed that.
Yeah, you do. You dispute it every time you claim a gradient or a gas pressure without a membrane.
First of all, Anthony, there's a massive difference between gas pressure and atmospheric pressure. Gas pressure would be in a container at a higher pressure than the surrounding atmospheric pressure, which is only due to the weight of the air molecules above pressing down. And a gradient is critical. You've accepted that there's a gradient. Well, I don't see how you can dispute that. But the gradient doesn't just suddenly stop at 7 psi. It carries on all the way down until it's immeasurable. So you have an immeasurable value next to zero, immeasurably low. That's massively, massively different than having 14.7 next to zero. And you know it.
Every time you say the word atmosphere, that's the claim that you're inferring. You're saying that you can have a gas pressure next to a vacuum or a container without a container. You're also saying it with a gradient as well. So you all do it every time you say the word atmosphere. Every single time.
Straw man. As I've just said, we do not claim that there is a pressure, atmospheric pressure, or indeed a gas pressure at all, right next to a vacuum. We have never said that. Stop misrepresenting the actual situation.
See how slow the diffusion is when the flask is now full of air.
Which is our model, because we must be contained, and that's where we get the gradient from. This is why I put it on screen. The gradient's caused by gases being contained, as we see in this experiment.
Well, I don't see how that is your model. We know the mix of the atmosphere, the percentage of oxygen, nitrogen and so on. So either all of space is filled with exactly the same, or over time our atmosphere would have been diluted by whatever it is up in space. It doesn't work. A twofer. We have never disputed that either. But is that really your model? Are you saying that all of space is full of air? I thought it was a dome. So which is it? Is it a dome that's keeping the atmosphere in? Or is it just very, very to non-existent dispersion based on the fact that all of space is full of air? Which you've never been able to show.
No, we're saying that there has to be containment to have gas pressure. It's in the definition.
But you just showed that bromine with air or something above it. That's not a container above it, is it? That's, you even said, an atmosphere with no particles. Not the same thing. So what I next do in my response video is break down each of those experiments, and Anthony is going to comment on them.
All the air has been removed from this apparatus, apart from the flask containing bromine, which is isolated by a tap.
Here it is diagrammatically. On the left, we got a flask with the bromine in, and on the right, a vacuum.
Now, what we need to do is make this, like this container, the size of Earth, but then give this the infinite size of the volume of space, right? The infinite, ever increasing, ever expanding into nothingness of the vacuum of space, right? The volume is infinite on this side, but it's very small. It's like the size of that eye, the dot on the eye there on this side. So scale's important here, because I pretty much know what he's going to say. He's going to say, oh look, you're going to end up with 5 in this one and 5 in that one. That's what he's going to say.
I was showing the experiment diagrammatically. It had fixed size containers. However, in reality, yes, the 0 side is infinite. The 10 side is the size of the Earth. It doesn't matter. Yes, I'm going to, you know what I'm going to show because you saw it just a moment ago. But let's carry on.
In a vacuum, there's no air to collide with.
Oh, nowhere to collide with in a vacuum.
The bromine diffuses much faster.
Boom.
So
There we go. See, scale's an issue. We're the dot. The rest of the vacuum of space is infinite. There would be no PSI here left, would there? Not 5 and 5, because the volume of space is infinite. This is dishonest.
Not dishonest. I was showing what the experiment was showing, i.e. a smallish amount of bromine and a fixed size container of the vacuum, and it's going to disperse. And in my diagram, 10 and 0 would disperse to roughly 5 and 5. I'm not claiming that that is our Earth and space system.
Another lying moron.
Anthony, I would never be rude enough to say that to you. We all know vacuums don't suck. So when that tap is open, the 10 psi of bromine expands into the flask on the right, which was vacuum, and equalises. So now we've got 5 psi of bromine throughout. I don't think anyone would argue with that, not even you, Mr. Sleepy Warrior.
Actually, I will, because that's not a representation of your model, is it?
I'm not going to labour the point or argue this, as that was just a breakdown of the experiment.
Your model would say that the infinite volume of space would suck all of the atmosphere off.
No. Even if gravity suddenly turned off, nothing would be sucked anywhere. The atmosphere would blow itself off and expand.
See how slow the diffusion is when the flask is now full of air.
Okay, the experiment is now reset. On the left hand side we've got a flask with 10 psi of bromine, and on the right a flask with 10 psi of air.
It takes several minutes to get just this far.
Okay, I remove my tap, and slowly, over a few minutes, molecules of the bromine from the 10 psi bromine flask slowly start dispersing amongst the right hand flask with 10 psi of air.
But that's only half the point, isn't it? Because the other half, the equal and opposite reaction, is some of the white side on this side would be dispersing into here, because otherwise you're creating 9.9 psi here and 10.1 psi there. So you're missing the equal and opposing reaction, aren't you?
Well, I didn't show the white dots of the flask on the right entering the bromine side, no, but it would do. Which, bearing in mind you said earlier on that that was your model, then why aren't we seeing the white bits amongst our atmosphere? Why isn't our bromine atmosphere being diluted? It doesn't happen. So that's a breakdown of the two example experiments shown in your video, neither of which I or anyone else would disagree with. In the second, we saw the bromine slowly disperse because it's just bumping and jostling with the air molecules. You're now claiming that's your model, well, that's the first I've heard of endless space filled with air.
That's because you don't understand how it works. If we have gas pressure, there must be containment by something. Might not be a dome. We use the word dome because it's easy to conceptualize. It's very intuitive. Doesn't mean it's true, but it's a model, isn't it? But we can conceptualize easily. But to have the gas pressure, it has to be contained. Otherwise it fucks off into space, doesn't it?
Okay, I can understand that. So either we've got a physical dome, that's one model, or something else containing the atmosphere. Air of some sort, as you've described. But as I said, there's no evidence of that, or our atmosphere would be diluted. The first example was the bromine, in effect, right next to a vacuum. We saw it rush into that vacuum to equalise. We don't disagree with that.
Yeah, you do, because that happens on your model, on your heliocentric model, where you have gas pressure next to a vacuum with no membrane. That's what happens, and you disagree with that. So you do disagree with that. Let's be honest, you do disagree with that.
But it's not our model. Again, making clear that that's not what we believe. There is no pressure, either atmospheric or other gas pressure, right next to a vacuum. Now, I agreed in your comment section that I wouldn't use gravity, and I won't. But I think that you'll agree, for whatever the reason, we do have a pressure gradient. We got 14.7 psi at sea level, dropping off as you raise in height. That can be easily shown. Witness the fact that, for instance, at the top of Everest, the pressure is much, much lower. And as you fly in an aircraft, it's lower still. I can't see how you can dispute that.
We don't.
Cool.
It's only possible on our model.
Why? So let's have a look at a further diagrammatic experiment.
The dispute arises when your model can't have that because you can't have gas pressure without a container. Right, that's where the dispute is. The gradient is only possible if we're contained.
Apparently not.
It is not possible if we're not contained. If we have an open system next to a vacuum of space on the other side of the tap, it all fucks off into the vacuum of space, the infinite vacuum of space. That's where the disagreement is. You can't claim that you can have a gradient on your model because you can't.
In this example, we're really, really high, and the air pressure has really dropped off, and it's currently at 0.000001 psi. And we've got bromine. On the other side, we have the vacuum again. Now, what do you think will happen when we open the tap? There is bromine in there, those molecules are flying around, and they are occasionally bumping into each other. Well, given time, the bromine in the left container will equalise with the vacuum in the right container, giving a...
So given time, he says, so is time an independent variable or was it open in the tap?
Well, I'm not going to argue the toss about time being an independent variable today. My point is, you open the tap and after a while it will have equalised, but it will take longer than it did when it was 10 and 0 because there's less bromine particles for each to hit against.
And the thing is, what you're not showing is the other layers of density that are next to it, that are the atmosphere, because they're also pushing out, looking for something to push against.
Well, I'm sorry I couldn't fit a full-scale diagram of the atmospheric gradient in that image. However, all of those particles are being pulled back towards Earth. They're trying to get down to Earth, either because of the force of gravity or because of the curvature in space-time. Makes no odds. one way or another, they're trying to go down, but they're being bumped and jostled around. The vacuum does not suck. It's the movement of the molecules and the bouncing of the molecules.
So it would release the top layer, and it would also release the layer behind it, and the layer behind that, and the layer behind that, and it would all be pretty much instantaneously.
Not instantaneously. There's no force forcing those molecules into the vacuum. All there is the molecules flying around and either being pulled back towards the Earth or colliding and going off into the vacuum. That's roughly 0.0000005 psi. But it won't be quick because there's not much bumping around. By definition, with a gradient, it will continue to get a lower and lower and lower pressure. So let's have a look at a final experiment. We're way higher still. The pressure is now so low it's barely measurable. And in our diagram we've only got 3 or 4 molecules of bromine in there. So what I'm trying to represent here would be approximately the Kármán line. There's barely anything there at all. Still something, but barely anything. So, Anthony, if I remove the tap this time, what do you think those 3 or 4 molecules are going to do? When they're
going to fill the available volume.
Prediction made. We know that vacuums don't suck, so the only movement from one side to the other can come from the bromine molecules themselves.
Correct.
Excellent. So there's no suck, there's no push, it's just bouncing around, flying in different directions, collide into the other container with 0. I'm glad we agree. So now I've removed the tap. The only reason that those bromine molecules will move from the left to the right container is if either they happen to move in exactly the right direction or if they bounce off something else, like
Correct.
Another bromine molecule. Your agreement is noted, which then changes their direction so they're moving towards the right-hand container.
Correct.
Other than that, there is no reason for those molecules to move. Fantastic! Still agreeing.
But the fact is they do, though.
Do I hear an aha from...
The fact is, though, they do, though, don't they?
You have agreed there's no suck from a vacuum. There's nothing pushing those molecules into the other side. Only them moving and colliding. That's all agreed. So why should they suddenly move to the other side? There is no reason. Plus, at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere, you have either gravity or space-time curvature, however you want to think of it, acting against those molecules, trying to hold them down. It's very weak, but it's there. So you have something trying to persuade them to stay, and random movement trying to let them go off into the vacuum.
It's not, they don't. It's not true to say that they will never go into there. They will always go into that other chamber. And then once the pressure is equalised, it will stay in equilibrium and they will pass evenly between the two of them.
I agree. In this diagrammatic experiment, again, they would equalise, like that previous example. It will take even longer because you're just relying on the random movement of the molecules to go into the right-hand side. That is my point. My point is it will not go whoosh into the other side and equalise. It will take time, a long time, a very long time, with just 3 or 4 molecules.
But again, you haven't got the size or the scale correct. The infinite vacuum of space is what you should be doing.
No. I could do it with the infinite vacuum of space. We could make that right-hand container an infinite size. That's not going to make the molecules from the left move any quicker. As we've already established, it's only them bouncing around, bumping off each other and going in the right direction. So you can make that vacuum, the volume of that vacuum, as big as you want. They're still only going to move across at the same rate. There's no sucking, remember?
All of the particles all go into the vacuum of space. There's nothing, there's no container, nothing stopping them from coming back, is there? That's the point.
I don't disagree. In reality, once a molecule has left our atmosphere and is free in space, it's gone. It's gone for good. And I say in the video that we lose hundreds of tons of atmosphere a day, but we got an awful lot of it. plus it's replenished. You, Mr. Riley, are you going to say, well, if that's the case, we would still be losing our atmosphere? Well, we do. We lose several hundred tons of atmosphere a day.
Evidence for that, please. And not citation. Evidence. Proof that we lose it to space every day. There is no evidence for that claim. It only happens on your model.
Well, I apologise that I can't launch rockets at this time. I haven't got enough patrons for that. However, have a look at this. It's NASA's Visions 2 mission, where they're imaging the atmospheric loss. I'll put a link in the description.
In the real world, on your model, what actually happens is everything gets lost on your model because your model doesn't have the ability to create pressure.
It does, through gravity stroke curvature of space-time, affecting the atmosphere, making each part of the atmosphere press down on the atmosphere below, giving atmospheric pressure.
Because it hasn't got anything to bounce off and it doesn't have a force pulling these atoms back. It's a one-way street on your model. It doesn't happen the way you're describing it. Your model doesn't have a gradient, but you're claiming a gradient, and that's not correct on your model, is it? You don't understand science.
But you have already accepted that something pulls things down, makes them want to go down. Whether you call that gravity, curvature of space-time, or something else, it's pushing it down. That is our model. And don't talk to me about understanding science when you used a TDS meter to measure density. But there's an awful lot of it. Plus, it tends to be the lighter elements, like hydrogen and helium, that we lose. That's why they're comparatively rare in our atmosphere.
None of the atmosphere should have these gases, nitrogen or oxygen, because they're all under pressure and they're pushing against the walls of the container that you do not have in your model. You also don't have a force to turn the particles back once they're heading away from the Earth.
Yes, we do. Gravity stroke space-time curvature. However, once they have achieved escape velocity, then they're gone for good.
Because Pascal's law states that it collides with the walls of its container, and that would be the Earth, evenly in all directions. You haven't got anything to turn the particles back.
The bottom of the container is the Earth. The sides of the container is whatever's next to it, so atmosphere next to atmosphere, atmosphere, all the way around. The top is maintained by gravitational attraction, i.e. the gradient, fading to zero. This is why people keep getting exasperated with you, Anthony, because you keep trying to show this, 10 psi for instance, next to 0 psi, and claiming it's our model, which it isn't. This would be closer to our model.
No, it wouldn't.
So there is no...
Because you've still got a container here, haven't you? This is not a container on your model, is it? This is not any closer than what I show. You're misrepresenting the scale to try and indicate that I'm off the target and that you're on the target, but you've still got a container. You need to remove this container and give it the infinite symbol, because that's what your model states. And when you have these and there's no container, none of it is going to come back. That's where the problem lies. So you need to redo this video. Instead of having a container here, have that as the infinite value and then no container, and then explain how you can have pressure on this side, because once they go through there, they are never coming back. Ever, 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 ever. It's a one-way street. Then particles are not coming back.
So either you do not understand the difference, or you're misrepresenting the argument.
Or you've just put a container here to try and give you the equalization, the equilibrium that you demand, that needs to be there for your model to work. But you don't have it, do you? So it's not me that's doing something wrong, moron. It's you.
Oh, I don't think we need to redo the entire video, Anthony. I just adjust the diagram. There you go, on the right, infinite space, nothing, nout, zilch, nada, just vacuum. And on the left, a container with 3 or 4 molecules of bromine. You've already agreed that that vacuum doesn't suck, that the only reason those particles will move is if they happen to be going in the right direction or collide. So it makes no difference how much vacuum there is on the other side. Vacuum is vacuum. You don't have more vacuum. Those particles will only move across if they happen to be going in the right direction or bump into each other and have that direction changed towards the vacuum. And acting against them, we have gravity, stroke, space-time curvature.
You need to redo this video without the container and explain how the particles come back, because they don't come back, do they, on your model? There isn't the mechanism or the force on your model to do it.
Once those particles have achieved escape velocity, yes, they're gone forever. But there's a shed load of them and they're being replenished. I don't need a container. I don't need to show particles returning. The fact that we have a gradient is a different question. You can't deny there is a gradient. We have an explanation for why.
But you don't have any evidence. You don't have an explanation that's practical science demonstrated. It's pseudoscience. If it doesn't comply with scientific method, with experiment, by definition it's pseudoscience.
Go climb a mountain with a barometer and you have already admitted or conceded that there is a gradient.
So your explanation without experiment is nothing. It's pseudoscience. We're asking, how do you have gas pressure without a container when we're in the middle of a vacuum? An infinite void. You can't do it, Mr. Sensible. So how's about you redo your video and answer that question? How do you have gas pressure without a container in the vacuum of space? You don't have a force of gravity, you don't have a container. What's the explanation?
And thus ended Mr. Sleeping Warrior, my chubby little friend. Anthony, you have your explanation. The explanation is there is no pressure next to a vacuum, so we don't need to defend that. There is a gradient leading down to zero, as you are aware, as you can witness by taking a barometer up a mountain. It's fine to just misunderstand someone's position, Anthony. That happens. But you've been told again and again and again. But all you keep doing is putting up this ridiculous straw man of pressured atmosphere next to a vacuum. It's disingenuous.
Where's me fucking singing?
Oh, I think not, Anthony. I'm not cruel. I've already subjected my viewers to your singing once. That's enough. If you haven't already, please like this video. Consider subscribing. Just hit mini-me down in the corner. Look forward to seeing you all again. Until next time, stay sensible.
Shut up and sit down.